Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gill Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gill@eapen.info. My guest today is Professor Oswald Schmitz, who's a professor of Population and Community Ecology in the Yale University School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. His research aims to make sense of nature's complexity that comes from interdependencies among the variety of carnivore, herbivore, and plant species that coexist within ecosystems. These insights help to inform environmental stewardship to enhance the conservation of wildlife species and ensure the sustainability of ecosystems, their functions, and the services they provide to humankind. Welcome, Oz.
Thank you, Gil. Just one small correction, and maybe I forgot to do it because we've just gone through it. We just changed the school's name. It's now the School of the Environment.
Environment, okay.
To signal to the broader world that we do more than just forestry research. We do all sorts of environmental research in the school, a whole diversity of environmental research in the school.
That's good. So it's Yale University School of Environment now.
Yes,
Okay.
That's the new name.
Perfect. So I want to start with your 2017 paper entitled Predator Community Composition is linked to soil carbon retention across a human land use gradient. You say that soil carbon storage is a major component of the carbon cycle. Consensus holds that soil carbon uptake and storage is regulated by plant microbe soil interactions. However, the contribution of animals in above ground food webs to this process has been overlooked. That's something that typically people don't think about that, right? So you want to talk a bit about how animals really interact with this process?
Certainly. Going back to the original conceptions in ecology, and these are long-standing, deeply ingrained ideas about how ecosystems work, and basically the idea is that plants are the most abundant in terms of biomass on the planet. If you look around everywhere, you see green here and there, and most of the world is green if it isn't built over in urban areas with cement, and so people have believed for the longest time that the plants, because they were so abundant, that they were the only things that really mattered in terms of taking up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, storing it in their biomass, and when they, at the end of the growing season died, all of that organic matter would go into the soil and then either be broken down by microbes or stored in the soil. And so most of the focus was on in the carbon cycle was really on looking at the plants and the soil and microbial interactions. The idea is that with habitat, animals require habitat, and usually that habitat is also vegetation. But the idea was, in terms of habitat, if they build it, we will come type of mentality. That is, if the habitat is there, if nature builds the habitat, then wildlife species will come to the habitat and live in the habitat, and that's a passive thing. What we're finding, however, is that wildlife that live in habitat, they also eat the habitat. They eat the plants.
Yeah.
So when they eat the plants, they get nutrition from the plants, and some of that is carbohydrate, which is really carbon-based. And so they consume the carbohydrate because they need that to support their energy needs. And so right away, the animals can lower the amount of organic matter, the dead leaves and twigs and everything that fall into the soil at the end of the growing season. That amount is lowered because the herbivores are eating that. But what's interesting, though, is that you can also have predators in the ecosystem that prey on the herbivores.
Yeah.
And so if there are fewer herbivores, there's less damage to the plants. And so the predators actually might become very important in protecting the amount of carbon that plants take up in the ecosystem. And so the predators are actually a beneficial factor to the carbon cycle because they promote it by reducing the amount of herbivore damage.
So this is a little bit counterintuitive, and I don't know anything about it. So if you look at the biomass of the plants themselves, one would have thought, without knowing a lot about it, one would have thought that the consumption of the plants by animals is a smaller part of the biomass, but that is not the case?
It doesn't have to be the case. The interesting part is there are two dimensions to this story. The first is that when herbivores damage plants, right, that they inflict a wound in the plant, and the plant then has to make a physiological adjustment. And what often happens is they shut off photosynthesis or slow down photosynthesis. And if you're slowing down photosynthesis, you're taking up less carbon out of the atmosphere. And the other part of it is because you're stressed, you're burning energy more. And so plants also burn the energy that they made, the carbohydrate that they produced. And so they respire a lot of the carbon back to the atmosphere because of the stress. And so the reduction in photosynthesis and the increase in respiration means that the plants are not taking up as much carbon, and they're also burning up and emitting the carbon back to the atmosphere. That will slow down as the plant heals itself. But if the animals are continually, in a recurring way, continually damaging the plants, then that photosynthesis slowdown and the increased respiration can be persistent over a long period. And even light browsing on the plant, even if a herbivore eats a few leaves or a small amount of biomass, the plant itself, feeling that it is being damaged, will actually shut the whole system down. And so herbivores actually have what we call a multiplier effect, an effect that's disproportionately larger than the damage it inflicts.
Wow.
And then the other dimension of that is some predators actually stress the herbivores out, right? And when you're stressed, you actually, when we're stressed, the first thing we do is we go to the pantry and look for cookies, the sugar, or go to the fridge and get an ice cream cone or something, because we're craving sugar, and that's craving carbohydrates. And so when predators are around, herbivores get stressed the same way we get stressed in very risky situations. And they start craving carbohydrates because their metabolism goes up. The fear factor actually increases their metabolism. And so they crave plants that actually hold a lot more carbon in them. And so they will preferentially feed on plants that are actually good at taking up carbon and storing it in their leaves.
Yeah, so this is a really complex process. So just the presence of animals in the wild and what they do, not just consuming plants, but trampling on the ground and really stressing out the plants themselves. And then you have the whole pyramid there in terms of predators and the herbivores. And the herbivores are getting stressed out, so they tend to consume consume carbohydrates, from plants that are more beneficial to the environment from a storage perspective. And so essentially, the whole stressed out system is able to store less carbon. Is that the idea?
That is correct. Yes. Yes. Exactly.
And so from an intervention perspective, so you have to really think about the entire system here, all the way from you have to look at all animals in the environment to see what might be sort of an ideal situation.
That is correct to some extent.
Yeah.
Um, the way we go about it, though, is if you think about nature, there is a dizzying complexity of all sorts of herbivore species, right? We have, when we're thinking of mammals, even here in the Northeast, we've got mice, we've got rabbits, we've got white-tailed deer. There are, even wild turkeys to some extent do, nibble on vegetation. And then we have a whole host of insect species also that are damaging the vegetation. And so, if you were to account for every species, it would be just really, really impossible to think about interventions. It would just blow your mind trying to imagine all of the interconnected complexity. So what we as ecologists try to do is think about things in a little more functional sense. And what we do is we group species according to their functional traits or their functional roles in a system. And so we can simplify the complexity a little bit by thinking about large herbivores versus small herbivores. We can think about, in the insect world, herbivores that are predominantly leaf chewers versus insects that actually bore into leaf tissue and suck the juices out of leaves. So we can group things and make them much more simple. And what we're finding is that species within a grouping, that is, if you're part of the large herbivore group or the small herbivore group, you have pretty similar effects when you're a part of that group. And so you can characterize the impact in a more simplified way. You're still recognizing differences, but you can control the complexity.
Yeah, it's such a non-linear system too, right? So if we were to fine-tune some aspects of this, either culling a species or a group of species, or enhancing the numbers in certain other parts of the system, any sort of artificial intervention could have a lot of non-forecastable effects, right?
They could, but what we're finding is we can get a handle on it. We can forecast things a little bit more precisely than you can imagine. And the advantage comes from grouping species according to similar roles that they play according to their functional traits. You can develop mathematical models that make predictions about that, and we've done that with our own work where you focus, for example, you can focus on a certain kind of predator feeding on a certain kind of herbivore group. And when I say a certain kind of predator, it could be a whole variety of predators that are largely sit and wait predators, or alternatively, a whole variety of predators that are actively hunting predators. Those groups have, species within those groups have the same kinds of effects on the herbivores. And so by sort of grouping things and then looking at their interconnections, we can make some decent predictions about the amount of carbon that should be stored in the soil, given the nature of the way they interact. And the paper that we're talking about right now is actually a validation of a model prediction, where we would argue that, with this kind of predation, you would see this much soil retention. And then with another kind of predator, you would see a very different soil carbon retention. We've made predictions about that, and the predictions actually bear out across that human land use gradient.
Is this? I don't know if this is already being done, or so. This sounds to me that there could be some sort of a monitoring system. There could be some AI techniques you could apply. If the objective function is, and I'm just making this up, if the objective function is to maximize carbon sequestration, then there is a characteristic that you're looking for in terms of the animals and the plants and actually in this case insects and the whole system, right?
Yes.
And so could we actually have some sort of a monitoring system that provides decision guidance as to how to maximize sequestration?
You could, and the way you would do that is you would think of the different species as a part of a portfolio
Yeah.
of organisms that you can pick. So, building on your economic argument, you could use what's called portfolio theory in a sense to think about, species with certain functional traits or groupings, and you know how much, if just that species group were present, you would store X amount of carbon. If you added a certain number of other groups from different, or number of individuals from different groups, you would get an incremental increase in carbon storage. It isn't always just simply additive though, but we can sort of come up with a way of characterizing how much carbon you can take up for every incremental increase in functional group that you add to the system. There is some what we call functional redundancy in the system. So the portfolio theory idea is you can incrementally add species from different functional groups and sort of build up complexity, and then you can sort of assess how much carbon you're storing for every incremental increase in number of groupings that you add. And part of it also is it's you're going to have diminishing returns eventually, because there is some certain amount of redundancy among species in their functional roles. So in other words, within a group of species that perform a similar function, obviously you don't need every species necessarily to perform that function. There are some backups. It's the same sort of idea as having several computers to back up, when you're flying a plane or using a space shuttle or something like that. So if one fails, you've always got another species, and that's part of the portfolio effect also. It provides you insurance so that you'll have some species that will perform the function if you lose others. But you can make some decent predictions about what exact portfolio of different kinds of functional species you might need to live together to maximize that. And then we do have technical instruments where you can actually measure and monitor the amount of carbon that's being stored or released.
Yeah, it sounds to me as that just the data from the air, from above, is not going to be sufficient, right? You need sort of ground-based monitoring.
Yes. I mean, to some extent, yes, although the technology is getting better. So you can use drones nowadays with this technology called LiDAR. And the LiDAR will actually be able to give you a three-dimensional portrait of the vegetation canopy or the habitat. And they have also sensors on LiDAR and drones nowadays where you can actually look at the color spectrum that's being emitted from the plants and tell what the chemical composition of the plant material is, which is just amazing. So you can do flyovers and figure out how much carbon is actually being stored in the vegetation. But to know how much is being stored in the soil, yes, you have to actually go on sample in the field and either take soil samples or stick probes in the soil and measure soil respiration.
Yeah, or something that is continuously doing it.
That's right. Correct. Yeah.
So in the paper, you say the study offers a generalizable understanding of the pathways through which anthropoid-predator community composition can contribute to ecosystem carbon storage. So you have some sort of a heuristic here. Can you use this to go to a new environment and do a diagnostic and say the capacity of that system in terms of sequestration is X?
Yeah, we can to some extent, and the reason why, again, the work that paper deals with is dealing with insects, mostly grasshoppers and spiders, but there are functional analogs in the mammal community too, so that in terms of diet selection and the way, let's say, a large grasshopper eats grass, there's a functional analog of that grasshopper in a mammal community eating the same kind of grass. And we've learned a lot about that working in Western prairie environments where there's a greater diversity of mammalian herbivores and a greater diversity of grasshopper species. What's really neat is you can do these experiments at the small scale and really validate the principles, your scientific principles. And then because there's an analog in the mammal community, the processes should replicate themselves. And so you can look at the mammals in the same way you look at the grasshoppers and spiders. Obviously, though, you cannot do experiments on them because the mammals roam over bigger spaces and you can't enclose them as easily. But what we do find is because they are functional analogs, they drive the carbon cycling in a similar way.
Yeah, so will the techniques be applicable also in very large systems like the Amazon or some African areas?
Yes. Yes. Again, certainly studying insects in all these places, things are transferable. And again, you can study these things in tropical forests. Tropical forests are a little more difficult because the canopy is closed. Makes it a little bit harder to track the animals. But certainly in African savannas and maybe boreal forests that aren't as dense, you can also track animals and monitor their movement and monitor their foraging behavior and monitor the predator-prey interactions. And do, as with this LiDAR technology, you can also then, measure the spatial differences in amount of carbon stored. And that's the basis of that other paper that I sent you, the paper the 2018 paper, where we talk about scaling, these principles up from, my experiments with spiders and grasshoppers to bigger landscape scales. And that's the scale actually where people really matter, because they also have different values for that landscape, right? In a tropical forest, people want to harvest timber, which also removes carbon from the landscape. They hunt animals, which could lead to loss of diversity, which could then impact the carbon cycle and all that. And so the bigger scale you take with your analysis, the more and more you actually have to think about how people are also becoming part of that that giant food web that you're trying to understand.
Right. We'll take a quick break, Oz. When we come back, I want to talk a little bit about your experiments in the spider grasshopper experiment, as well as the zoogeochemistry and the scale up of this.
Okay, that sounds good.
Thank you. This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com. So we are back. Oz, we are talking about soil carbon storage and the carbon cycle. And typically we think about this as a plant microbe soil interaction as being the most important one. But your research and your papers are pointing to the contribution of animals in that carbon sequestration process and that carbon cycle process. And so you have done a lot of experiments around this. One of them is that involve spiders and grasshoppers and different types of spiders, and they all have different effects on the environment, right?
That's correct.
So how does that experiment go?
So, as I mentioned earlier, there are different hunting modes of that predators may adopt, predator species may adopt. Some are sit and wait. They just lie in ambush and hiding in ambush, and then others are widely roaming, and they roam all over the vegetation and in search of prey. What's really interesting, though, is the cues they leave differ. So a sit and wait ambush predator, the grasshopper actually ends up being a pretty smart little critter. They know where the risky neighborhood is, but the thing is, these sit and wait predators are also smart. They lay in wait near the best parts of the vegetation, where the most nutritious parts of the vegetation are. And so the grasshoppers, when they're facing sit and wait ambush predators, they know the risky neighborhood, but they also are attracted to that neighborhood to get the best nourishment. And so they have to play a trade-off game of how much do I go there and how much do I back off and not eat. And sometimes, they don't get as much nutrition. They aren't as damaging on the vegetation simply because they're scared to eat in those areas. So the predators don't even have to kill them to reduce the impact that the grasshoppers have on the vegetation. But the other thing that happens is, because they know it's a fearful part of the landscape, their metabolism goes up again, because again, they're scared. This is a risky neighborhood, and when they get scared, and their metabolism goes up, they become much more agile and agitated. That helps them escape predation, but it also means that they have to eat more carbohydrate to fuel that added energy. The widely roaming predators, on the other hand, they're all over the place, so that a grasshopper doesn't know at any one moment where that predator is. And so if it was completely fearful all the time, it might be wasting opportunity to eat vegetation when it really didn't have to, right? Because it's not going to encounter the predator. And so it behaves entirely different. And this could be the same individual grasshopper facing different predators. And so what we find is the grasshoppers that are facing the actively hunting predators, they eventually get picked off by the predators. They get killed. And so there are fewer herbivores to eat the vegetation. And so a lot of the vegetation, and in a lot of cases, the plants with a lot of carbohydrate in them don't get eaten. The metabolism, their photosynthesis and their respiration doesn't change. And so a lot of that vegetation ends up in the soil. And so you store a lot of carbon in the soil when the hunting mode of the predator is an active hunting predator. With the sit and wait predator, on the other hand, because your metabolism is increased and you're craving these carbohydrates, you're eating the carbon out of the plants, right? You're damaging the plants. You're also lowering their ability to do photosynthesis, but you're eating also those valuable carbohydrates out of the plants. So at the end of the growing season, those plants have less carbon that goes in the soil. So you store substantially less carbon when you're facing a sit and wait predator as opposed to an active hunting predator.
But presumably it's a sort of an unstable system, right? At some point, if you have active hunting spiders, at some point they will run out of grasshoppers, won't they?
No, because there are upper limits on how much a predator can eat in any given amount of time. So, again, it's a diminishing returns. A predator, it's the same thing as you. We just had Thanksgiving. You just, you can't, you can eat a turkey dinner, but eventually you become so full in a period of time that you can't take in more food, right? And that's true within a day. That's true within a week for a predator. That's true within the summer. So when you have a lot of grasshoppers around, it is virtually impossible for you to wipe out all of the grasshoppers.
But is there sort of an optimum ratio between grasshoppers and active active hunting spiders and sit and wait spiders that makes the system in a sort of a stable?
The ratio, yes, in certain abundances, but that's really determined by the ratio of body sizes. Really, it's
Mm.
more, um, spiders of a certain body size are needed to be able to kill a grasshopper of a certain body size. So you need pretty big hunting spiders to kill a grasshopper. And with other, let's say, smaller sap-feeding insects, really tiny ones, they would be unprofitable for the spider because they're just too small. The predator would expend too much energy to try and catch them to make it worth their while. So smaller predators are better suited to eat the smaller prey. And so so in terms of functional equivalence, again, you have what we call trait matching, is that a predator of a certain size is needed to kill a prey of a certain size. And again, that simplifies some of the complexity because you can match predator and prey body sizes and look at those smaller groups of species that have similar sizes, and understand their interactions that way. And that's really where the balance comes in. So for example, if you had a large predator that wasn't very effective at eating small prey, then there would be an imbalance because the prey would really become highly abundant because they wouldn't be controlled by their predator.
Right, right. And your other paper in 2018, you say that recent results suggest that functional traits are malleable, enabling species to rapidly respond and adapt to each other as environmental conditions change, with predictable effects on ecosystem processes. So again, this is a very dynamic system, right? That different animals are responding to changes that they're observing, and I would imagine, it's a game that continues to evolve, right?
That's correct. And again, what I mean by malleable or flexible is the case I just gave. So let's suppose you have a grasshopper that's living in a meadow, or a bunch of grasshoppers living in a meadow, and let's suppose they're facing these sit and wait ambush predators. Their metabolism is heightened, because they're living in this risky environment. There's a lot of apprehension and anxiety, and they're being agitated, so that they can escape the predators better. But then let's suppose somehow those predators disappeared, and we ended up having predators with just active hunting styles that didn't create the same kind of fearful environment. Then again, because from an economic standpoint, it wouldn't make sense for the herbivore to waste all that energy when it didn't need to. It will actually lower its physiological processes, lower its metabolic rate, become less stressed, and go about changing how it feeds and what it feeds on. And so that's what I mean by malleable or flexible. The same individual between a highly risky environment or a low risk environment adjusts its physiology and its behavior to accommodate those different environmental conditions, and then optimize its resource intake for those conditions. The amazing thing that grasshoppers do that against spiders tells us that these animals can really sense their environment and actually make active decisions. These animals are smart. They're not just automatons that just sort of wander around and respond instinctively. They make active choices. So that's the amazing thing that you learn when you study these species.
Yeah, and obviously there is a selection effect happening from an evolutionary
Of
perspective
course.
too. So,
Yes.
so those who
Yes.
survive, yeah, continue to get
Yeah.
smarter. I would imagine. And so if you were to optimize this, it seems to me, Oz, that there is fair amount of predictability here. So given a set of initial conditions in an environment, you could predict, if with no intervention, where that system might end up in.
Yeah, you could predict. so we can develop mathematical models that describe how the abundance of the animals change, how their physiology changes, and what that means for their feeding. And then you can make predictions about, let's suppose this kind of predator came in or that kind of predator. What would be the ripple effects, the cascading effects on the vegetation, and how much carbon is stored in the environment. And that's what I mean by generalizable principles. Hunting mode, all predators can be assigned to a hunting mode. The herbivores, they're grazers. You can look at mammals as grazers. And so by doing this, you can make some reliable predictions about how, if we were to change the habitat conditions that change the risk environment for these animals, we could predict what the outcome would be.
Yeah, I mean, this is still the most efficient and least expensive carbon sequestration process. So I wondered, um, would you recommend? I mean, we could potentially genetically engineer certain species, right? That will have a beneficial effects on sequestration, or is it taking it a bit too far?
You could, but what I've been talking about is what we call nature-based solutions, or natural carbon sequestration. You're taking advantage of nature, and I'm not saying that nature is going to rescue us. Let me preface this first by saying we still have to reduce our carbon emissions if we want to balance the global carbon cycle, but we haven't tapped nature enough, I think. And so one of the reasons why people have started looking at technology is because of the classical way that people calculate the carbon budget. They assume that these animals don't have an impact. They only think about the plants, the soil, and the microbes, right? And when you do that, what we can show, or what the scientific community can show is that you underestimate or overestimate sometimes the capacity of the plants themselves with the soil and the microbes to take up carbon. You under or overestimate by anywhere from 50 to 70%. So in other words, if you're underestimating, what that means is there's missed opportunity in really trying to use nature to even increase the amount of carbon that you could take up. So and when you're overestimating it, what it means is we actually have to think about maybe what management interventions we can take to reduce that overestimate of carbon that we're coming up with.
Yeah, so is there a similar thing going on in the ocean, or is not something that you study?
I don't study it directly, but there are some really interesting implications, not only in the ocean, but in coastal systems especially. So even here in New England, there's an interesting interaction. You've got salt marsh grasses in New England, and crabs normally feed in those salt marshes. But the crabs and these salt marshes are really, really good at storing carbon. They're much better than forests, actually, because basically the dead organic matter, the dead leaves from the salt marsh grasses, end up going underwater, and it becomes low oxygen conditions, which doesn't promote microbial breakdown, so it just stays there as dead organic matter, and it's just carbon. It's built up carbon. And you go along the New England seacoast, and there's hundreds of years of carbon that's been stored there. There's old carbon and new carbon. But the thing is, with the tides coming in and out, what you have is fish, especially bluefish, that come in with the tide, and they feed on the crabs. And so they prevent the crabs from overeating the vegetation, right? And so the bluefish are actually protecting the carbon in the salt marsh. But the thing is, what we're doing with sport fishery, to some extent, in parts of New England, they've been overfished. And so when the tide comes in, there's no longer fish coming in. And so the crabs that eat the vegetation thrive. And there's a reduction in salt marsh grasses that are persisting. And even they get overeaten. And what that means is the roots disappear from the salt marsh, where the rooting disappears. And so the tide also washes all that carbon back into the ocean. And out there, actually, microbes can start breaking down the carbon, and then it goes back to the atmosphere. So who would have thought that sport fishing can actually alter the carbon cycle?
Yeah, I mean, if we are off, as you say, 50 to 70% either direction, from a policy perspective, this is a
It is.
huge thing, right?
Yeah, yeah. No,
Yeah,
you're right.
and so what's your sense? Are we, if you look at the entire, sort of large systems, which are, still big sinks of carbon, what is your sense? Are we overestimating or underestimating the sequestration?
It depends where you're looking, but I think in a lot of cases we're underestimating. You know, we're underestimating the capacity of ecosystems to take up carbon.
Hmm. And the amount that gets in is also a function of the concentration in the air, I would imagine, right? The processes will change as the concentration
The
increases.
concentration in the atmosphere.
A concentration of CO2, for example,
Yes,
increases in the
yes,
atmosphere.
that can change because again, photosynthesis can only operate at a certain fixed rate, right? And even if there were no herbivores, plants can max out on their photosynthetic ability to take up carbon. So that's why nature-based solutions are good, but eventually we're going to run out of the opportunity if we just continue to pollute the atmosphere. And one of the things that limit photosynthesis also is soil nutrients. And if you have a lot of carbon in the atmosphere, pretty soon the plants will tap out the soil nitrogen to the point where they won't meet their demand for nitrogen to be able to run the enzymes that run photosynthesis, and you won't be able to take up as carbon anymore. And again, that's that diminishing returns idea also.
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue we have is, if I understand this correctly, the system is sort of self-equilibrating, provided it is within a range. When it's outside that range, it's sort of a step function effect, right? And you get runaway processes that you can really
Exactly.
bring back.
Yeah, exactly.
So, right?
So,
Yeah.
what that means is we can't just rely on nature. What we have to do is also think about transitioning away from fossil fuel uses to run our economy and transition to renewable energies. But again, what I see is we can't do a sudden transition. Obviously, we have to do that gradually. We can't shock the economy, but because of the untapped potential that there's still more room for nature to take up carbon, we can use that as sort of a stopgap measure at the same time that we start slowly reducing our reliance on fossil fuel emissions. And so as we increase our reliance on nature, we can slowly decrease our reliance on fossil fuel technology and switch to green energy.
Yeah, so this might give us still a window of of survival, so to speak. That if we do everything correctly, as you say, reducing the fossil fuel use, but simultaneously increasing the natural sequestration processes, we might still be able to get out of the issue that we're
Correct.
currently on.
It is one, as people say, it's one wedge in this, one stabilization wedge in a portfolio of other solutions to deal with global climate change. Yes.
Yeah, and as we just briefly mentioned, there's a similar thing going on in the ocean. I think very large animals, like whales, for example, when they die, they actually go we sink all the way to the bottom of the sea and get has a higher level of sequestration in them. And so there is also, some sort of a balancing act in the ocean that
That's
one could
correct.
engineer.
It's not only whales, it's also, thinking about fisheries. And fish do the same. If you don't harvest them and they get old, um, the old ones die and they sink also. A good number of them sink. Some of them do get broken down by microbes in the ocean. But the other interesting thing, though, is with the whale story, is whales, obviously their carcasses hold carbon, but they also, in the course of diving down to the depths of the ocean and feeding and then coming to the surface waters, when they defecate into the water, they bring nitrogen into the surface waters and also sometimes iron, which both are really important for phytoplankton in the ocean, algae in the ocean. And so what that does is nourishes the phytoplankton, and then they'll suck out carbon out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis themselves. And when they get old and die, they sink to the ocean floor also. And the ocean floor is a long-term carbon storage sink. You can store carcasses down there at depth for thousands of years. And also the zooplankton, again, you have these food chains in the marine realm, the zooplankton that die, and the zooplankton's particles that they defecate will also sink. And so there's a lot of opportunity to use the ocean as a carbon sink and long-term storage.
Yeah. So in conclusion, Oz, what would you suggest looking forward in a 5 to 10 year window? What would be sort of the policy ideas that you would pursue from a natural sequestration perspective?
Well, first of all, we have to appreciate that there isn't a silver bullet here with nature. What we have to do is there isn't some single global strategy that we could use. Instead, what we need to do is think about our local environments. And here, the adage, think globally, act locally, is really, really important. If we understand our local ecosystems and different, tropical ecosystems work differently than northeastern forests. But if we think about the forest ecology and trying to keep the forest healthy, and that includes keeping the animals in the forest also, and really thinking about that in a local context where we can actually do something about it by protecting as much of green space as we can. But also, we have to use it for our livelihoods, but figuring out how do we use that for our livelihoods, but also ensure the carbon values that we get out of them, then I think we can actually slowly solve some problems and tailor our solutions to the local values and wishes and dreams and welfare of people in local communities.
Yeah, so there is no what you're suggesting, if I understand it correctly, Oz, is that it is not going to be one size fits all. It has to be really localized, customized policies that each country, each state in the US
or region,
really.
like New England works together really well on solving some of these problems. So even just thinking regionally, like the New England Governors Association or the Western Governors Associations are regional governing, and they think about their region. But the nice thing about doing that, as you say, it's sort of thinking about the people that live in the place. And so when we really understand their values, you get more buy-in than if it was a one-size-fits-all solution.
Right. Excellent. Yeah, this has been great, Oz. Thanks so much for spending time with me.
This was wonderful. I had a great time.
Yeah, and good luck with this research.
Okay,
it's really important. This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.